The northern kingdom of Israel comes to an end after centuries of God's repeated warnings to them.
Welcome to Mission 66, stepping into Scripture for a better understanding of how God's Word intersects with our lives. Mission 66 is a ministry of TWR in partnership with Dr. Louis Sayao. Today, we're in 2 Kings, and our hosts, John Matthews and Esther Sisulu, are about to start the discussion. If you don't have a study guide, don't worry. It's free to download at mission66.org. Now here's Esther.
Today, we are moving further into the second book of Kings, and we're looking at chapters 16 and 17, and we're so glad to be here with you. Now, these chapters, they describe the history of the kings of Israel and of Judah, who were two separate kingdoms at this time. And we begin at the rule of King Ahaz of Judah, whose sin became its own punishment. And we'll also read about the exile of the northern kingdom, Israel. Well, our teacher, John Matthews, is with us and will lead us in this episode with the theme, Consequences of Spiritual Compromise.
Esther, thank you so much, and a very warm welcome to this latest episode of Mission 66 as we head into chapter 16 of 2 Kings. Now, the northern kingdom Israel had, very nearly hit rock bottom, sold out to Baal worship, and the southern kingdom, Judah, they were drifting further and further away from God themselves. And so chapter 16 here introduces us to the reign of Ahaz, the son of Jotham. So let's read it, beginning in verse 2. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord his God, as his father David had done, but he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. He even burned his son as an offering, according to the despicable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. One of the practices of Baal worship was the sacrificing of children to the idol. And here Ahaz is guilty of this, and this was one of the things that made God so angry. Verse 5, Then Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up to wage war on Jerusalem, and they besieged Ahaz, but they could not conquer him. At that time, Rezin, the king of Syria, recovered Elath for Syria and drove the men of Judah from Elath. And the Edomites came to Elath, where they dwell to this day. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel, who are attacking me. Now here we see Ahaz willing, it seems, to go to nearly any length to deliver himself from distress, except to God. So here he's hiring the Assyrians to help him against Israel, whom he considered to be his enemy. And it's common, isn't it, for those who suffer the consequences of one sin to try to help themselves out by committing another. And in verse 9, then, we see the king of Assyria marching up against the Syrian capital, Damascus, taking it, carrying its people captive to Kir, and he kills Rezin. And then verse 10 says this, When King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, he saw the altar that was at Damascus, and King Ahaz sent to Uriah the priest a model of the altar and its pattern, exact in all its details. And Uriah the priest built the altar in accordance with all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Uriah the priest made it before King Ahaz arrived from Damascus. And when the king came from Damascus, the king viewed the altar. Then the king drew near to the altar and went up on it and burnt his burnt offering and his grain offering and poured his drink offering and threw the blood of his peace offerings on the altar. And the bronze altar that was before the Lord he removed from the front of the house, from the place between his altar and the house of the Lord, and put it on the north side of his altar. A lot of talk about altars here, so bear with us on this. But God's altar belonged in the temple of Jerusalem, but Ahaz was putting another altar in its place. And sometimes we see, don't we, mankind having a kind of religious notion and trying to do things the way that they see best. But we know from the Bible that there is a way to do things. It's called the Word of God and through the Spirit of God. If not, there's the risk of idolatry, or you give worshippers false hope with meaningless ceremonies, sometimes referred to as empty religion. And here you have King Ahaz chopping up the temple furniture, rearranging things according to his own will in order to try and please the king of Assyria. And then into chapter 17, it describes, unsurprisingly now, because this is the pattern that we see, the demise of the northern kingdom Israel. And what had led to that demise? Well, there was a warning, but they didn't listen. 2 Kings 17 says, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria over Israel. Now he reigned 9 years, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, the king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it. So Samaria had been captured, and their attackers carried the Israelites away to Assyria. Remember that Samaria is the capital, or the central place in the 10 tribes that were known as Israel. And the Israelites were carried away to Assyria. And verse 7 begins the explanation as to why they were overrun. It says, and this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built for themselves high places in all of their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. You might be thinking, you've mentioned that word asherim a few times. What does it mean? Well, asherim were idol statues that represented sex goddesses. That's why they were forbidden, but it was part of the spiritual compromise that was bringing the nation down. And then verse 11 says this, and there they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did whom the Lord carried away before them, and they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. And they served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this. Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways. Keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers and that I sent to you by my servants, the prophets. But they would not listen, but were stubborn, as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenant that he made with their fathers, and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false. And they followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do like them. And they abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God. They made for themselves metal images of 2 calves. They made an Assyria, and they worshipped all the host of heaven and served Baal. And they burned their sons and their daughters as offerings, and used divination and omens, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and he removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. And the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel and afflicted them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he had cast them out of his sight. Verse 21 then recounts the history, the beginnings of the 10-tribe nation of Israel under Jeroboam, saying, when he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. And Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord and made them commit great sin. The people of Israel walked in all the sins that Jeroboam did. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had spoken by all his servants the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. And the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Zarephaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. And at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So the king of Assyria was told, the nations that you have carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land. Therefore he has sent lions among them, and behold, they are killing them, because they do not know the law of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded, send there one of the priests whom you carried away from there, and let him go and dwell there and teach them the law of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came, and he lived in Bethel and taught them how they should fear the Lord. So the people who captured Samaria from the Israelites, well, they recognized God, whilst the original inhabitants, the Israelites themselves, did not. And so what do the captors do? They bring in Bible teachers to instruct their fellow invaders how to conduct themselves properly in the land that they'd taken from Israel. But the only problem was that the newcomers continued to worship their gods in addition to the God of Israel. And, well, look, we know God does not go for that. That just doesn't work. And that word for that dual worship is called syncretism. It means a blend of the true with the false, the good with the bad. And from verse 29 to 32, we see how the new population of Samaria had these whole host of idols, actually, as well as the God of Israel. And verse 33 sums it up well when it says, so they feared the Lord, but they also served their own gods, after the manner of the nations from among whom they had been carried away. Verse 34 says, to this day they do according to the former manner. They do not fear the Lord, and they do not follow the statutes or the rules or the law or the commandment that the Lord commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. The Lord made a covenant with them and commanded them, you shall not fear other gods or bow yourselves to them or serve them or sacrifice to them, but you shall fear the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt with great power and with an outstretched arm. You shall bow yourselves to him, and to him you shall sacrifice. And the statutes and the rules and the law and the commandment that he wrote for you, you shall always be careful to do. You shall not fear other gods, and you shall not forget the covenant that I've made with you. You shall not fear other gods, but you shall fear the Lord your God, and he will deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies. However, they would not listen, but they did according to their former manner. So these nations feared the Lord and also served their carved images. And their children did likewise, and their children's children, as their fathers did. So they do to this day. Now, when it says to this day, Esther, it obviously is not to this particular day. It means up to the time that it was written, probably around 500 BC. So in 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel came to an end after centuries of God's repeated warnings to them over and over and over again. Tragically, the people's persistent rebellion, their sin, their idolatry lead to their downfall.
This is Mission 66, and I'm Esther, here with our teacher, John Matthews. And as we look through these chapters of the book of 2 Kings, chapters 16 and 17, really seeing how idolatry has such a stronghold on Israel. But you know what? I think let's get into some discussion time now, John. And I want us to start off with why Hoshea, the king of Israel, sought help from Egypt. Why would he do that, considering the history that they have?
Well, as time goes on, alliances change, don't they, when people are seeking power? And as the kingdoms weakened here, the kings of Israel and Judah were facing the temptation of selling themselves out and forming alliances with powerful rulers around them. At the time, Assyria was the strongest nation. However, Egypt, whilst not the most powerful in the world, still had vested interests in the region and was moderately influential. So the region of Israel and Judah was this trade corridor that connected Egypt in North Africa with Mesopotamia and Asia Minor, which is in modern-day Turkey. So it was this critical passageway for the world's leading powers. And so everybody, it seemed, wanted a hand in taking control of it. And it appears that King So of Egypt, well, he was part, it seems, of the Ethiopian dynasty, which took control of Egypt around the beginning of the 8th century BC. Now, he's mentioned in historical literature, not a particularly strong or notable king, but Hoshea nonetheless does ask him for help. As it turns out, well, he didn't end up being much help.
Yeah, and you know what? Something else that's quite interesting to note is the Assyrians and how they repopulate Samaria after all that they did to exile so many people out of it. And they did all that just to live elsewhere. Why would they do that?
Well, it was a kind of military strategy, I guess, Esther. The Assyrians, fearing that the conquered people may rise in a unified rebellion against their rule. So in order to prevent that, they shuffled people around. So, look, if I plan a rebellion and I'm surrounded by my friends, people that I know, those who speak my language, it's much easier to organise. But if I'm amongst a diverse group of people from different nations, speaking languages I don't understand, then trying to organize a unified resistance becomes pretty much impossible. So by mixing the populations, the Assyrians hoped that nobody would be able to rise up against them. But look, here's the interesting thing, because this very mixture of people groups gave rise to the Samaritans, who were a blend of Israelites with other nations. Now, this blending was seen as a dilution of the pure bloodline, which was abhorrent to the people of Judah. And this is why later in the New Testament we see the Jews hating the Samaritans. And by the time that Jesus appears, the Samaritans were considered the lowest of the low in society. And so when he says we need to love and seek the blessings of the Samaritans in addition to other peoples around the world, that's why many of his followers resisted that teaching.
Well, that's amazing to think about, because that emphasizes why Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan is so striking for us as we read it in the Bible.
Yeah, that's right. The parable is saying that even culturally speaking, of in that day, a Samaritan, people who were by now hated by the Jews, who showed mercy to a poor injured wayfarer who had fallen among robbers, was more righteous than the priests and the good people who passed him by and offered no help. Well, that was a bit of an insult or a slap in the face to the Jews, who considered themselves pure and holy just because they were descended from the right bloodline. In fact, there was pride right through the grain of that story, and it was interesting that it was the Samaritan who was the one who stopped to help.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, John, a very highly debated subject is whether the Bible is against interracial marriage.
Yeah, and there's no need for it to be highly debated, because the answer is no. Moses had a Cushite wife. Solomon married a daughter of the Egyptian Pharaoh. And look, the main problem in Israel was idolatry. The Israelites were warned not to intermarry with surrounding nations out of concern that they would influence Israel toward idolatry. That was the thinking. It had nothing to do with race.
All right, that's great. Well, I do have this age-old question that I suppose has intrigued people for centuries, and that's where the 10 tribes of the Northern Kingdom, Israel, actually are. I mean, what happened to them? Did they just disappear off the face of the earth?
Yeah, we don't have any concrete evidence, actually, as to what happened to those 10 tribes, Esther. It appears that they were assimilated into other populations. Look, some references in the New Testament, like Anna and Simeon, who are from the tribe of Asher, suggest that some individuals were able to trace their lineage. However, a significant portion of those tribes were, we can't say they were lost, because God knows who's descended from whom. But as far as human genealogy goes, it is difficult to discern, to say with certainty that we know where those tribes are. Over time, people have created theories, and some claim to be from this or that lost tribe. But all of those ideas very often are speculative. We know that the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained intact because Judah was exiled to Babylon and eventually returns. And in fact, today's Jews are thought to be those who are descendants of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin.
Well, thanks for that, John. This has truly been an interesting look at biblical history once again. So let's go ahead and do the summary.
Yeah, and our theme was consequences of spiritual compromise, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah facing severe spiritual decline marked by idolatry, rebellion against God. King Ahaz of Judah, well, he embraces Baal worship, even sacrificing his own son, then seeks help from Assyria rather than turning to God during a military crisis. Similarly, Israel's last king, Hoshea, seeks Egypt's aid against Assyria but fails, and that leads to Israel's downfall. And in 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel is conquered by Assyria, and its people are exiled due to their persistent sin and idolatry despite repeated prophetic warnings. Assyria repopulates Samaria with diverse groups to prevent rebellion. creating this mixed population that later would become known as the Samaritans, despised actually by the Jews of Judah for diluting the Israelite lineage. And this passage highlights the consequences, doesn't it, of spiritual compromise, syncretism, which is mixing true worship with idolatry, also disobedience to God's covenant. And the northern kingdom's demise just illustrates how rebellion led to divine judgment and exile. Meanwhile, Judah's continued drift from God sets the stage for its eventual exile as well. And the discussion also touches on the origins of the Samaritans and their strained relationship with the Jews. Finally, the fate of northern Israel's 10 tribes, well, it remains unclear. Speculation about their assimilation into other populations, whilst noting that the tribes of Judah and Benjamin do remain intact after their return from captivity in Babylon. But that is ahead of us.
And that is all we have for you today, dear friend. Thank you so much for joining us. And I especially would love to thank you for your prayers and your financial partnership with Mission 66. You know, this truly allows us to reach listeners in multiple languages around the world. As you know, we broadcast in English, but also in Spanish, in Indonesian, and in other languages. And perhaps if you'd like to donate to this ministry, we invite you to visit us at mission66.org. That's mission66.org. Well, I'm Esther, for John and our team, saying thank you so much for being here. See you next time on Mission 66.
As Mission 66 comes to a close, be sure to download your free study guide at mission66.org. Deepen your daily devotion with insights from each episode, and let John and Esther lead you through the scriptures. Get your study guide at mission66.org and be prepared for our next episode. There, you can also connect with us, ask questions, or donate to help Mission 66's worldwide outreach. Head to mission66.org. Mission 66 is made possible through Transworld Radio in partnership with Dr. Luis Sayao.